Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes for people to log in, and then we'll get started. All right, everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's installment of What's Up in the Watershed webinar hosted by the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. This month, I am very happy to have my good friend Annie Roddenberry, a biological scientist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, talking about her living shoreline stabilization project at Tomoka State Park. Annie is a regional biologist in Northeast Florida and focuses on aquatic habitat conservation and restoration. In this role, she protects and restores marine and estuarine resources such as oyster reefs, mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass beds, and does them quite well. She works with partners to plan and implement projects that create functional wetlands and improve coastal resilience. Annie's going to be presenting us with this project today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them into the Q&A section of the webinar, and we will be sure to answer them after the presentation is finished. So Annie, with that, take it away.
Thanks, Jesse, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here and tell you all a little story about the work that I've been doing at Tomoka State Park with my colleagues at University of Central Florida, Dr. Melinda Donnelly, Dr. Linda Walters, and Dr. Paul Sachs, and of course in partnership with the Department of Environmental Protection, since it is a state park. So we've primarily been working with Alice Bard and then the park manager, Terry Newman's there. So Tomoka is a very interesting story for two primary reasons. One is it's a really, really special place. And that's not just my opinion. I have 4,000 years of evidence to back that up, which we'll get into. But also because the work that we've done at Tomoka State Park has happened in phases over about 8 years now. And it really encapsulates this bigger picture of transitioning from the plastic-based oyster restoration materials to more to the non-plastic alternative options. And so that's what I'm going to kind of lay out is the work that we've been doing there, the needs that arose, and how we've tackled the stabilization there. So lots of help on this project, as you'll see throughout the presentation. There's been funding from FWC, but also the National Estuary Program, and lots of help from other groups like Coastal Conservation Association and Marine Discovery Center. Some of you on this call may have been up to Tomoka sweating and digging with us, and we thank you for that. If not, opportunities coming soon. So just a little context, I think most of you are familiar with living shoreline stabilization. You may have seen the SAGE diagram, which is that sort of green to gray spectrum. This is a more simplified version from Smith et al. 2020, and it breaks it down by energy. So you have a low energy on the left, which is just vegetation, a medium energy, which requires some sort of low profile breakwater, and then a higher energy, which might require something a little bit more heavy duty, like rocks in front of that vegetation. And I like this simplification because if you've seen FloridaLivingShorelines.com recently, the team working on that has given that site a makeover and has really focused on breaking down what's going on in Florida according to these energy levels. So the energy at your site is really going to help dictate the materials to use, the project design. And so, this is sort of a good perspective to use, and we'll see at Tomoka some of these different options. So again, that sort of vegetated option, and then a low profile oyster breakwater. And then we have that higher energy on the right with the rock revetment along the shoreline. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little more context about Tomoka State Park. And on this map, it's this, I don't know if you all can see my cursor, but it is this sort of lime green peninsula right here on the map. And what I want you to take away from this is that it's part of some connected conservation land. So it's jointly managed with Addison Blockhouse State Park and Bulow Creek State Park. And those are connected with the Tomoka Marsh Aquatic Preserve and North Peninsula State Park, Gamble Rogers, all the way up the Intracoastal Waterway. Then you're up into Pellister Creek and Washington Oaks Gardens area. And so there's a nice network and corridor of conservation land along here. But Tomoka State Park is sort of the southern terminus of this corridor before a very highly developed area here. This is Ormond Beach, getting down into Daytona Beach. And it's very, very developed all the way to Ponce Inlet. So Tomoka State Park represents sort of a little safe haven, of conservation land at the edge of this highly developed area near Ponce Inlet. And you might notice there's an interesting feature here, a little basin. And if we zoom in, this is Tomoka Basin right here. So we have the Tomoka River coming in, Bulow Creek, and then the Intracoastal Waterway or the Halifax River over here. And this area is really, really rich in natural resources. It's just a really neat estuarine feature. And again, I'm not the only one to think so. There is evidence at this site of occupation and settlement for over 4,000 years. So archaeological surveys began in the area in 1881 and continued until the late 90s. And those archaeological surveys showed us that there is a significant midden and mound and series of mounds in this peninsula, to the tune of this had probably been a continuous midden 2 miles in length. So I want you guys to think a little bit about the density and longevity of occupation in that area that would have built up a midden 2 miles in length. And so now it's a broken series of mounds. It's been disturbed over time by construction development and erosion. But radiocarbon dating in that area takes it back to the late and middle Archaic, so over 4,000 years before present, which is very significant and push back the timeline of Native American burial mounds that we previously had in Florida. So a really significant archaeological site. This is also the location of the Nokoroko Timucuan village. Again, this is a large settlement that was from the late Archaic to the St. John's period. And the St. John's period was about a 2,000-year period that was really important for Native cultures in Florida. So this is when there were a lot of settlements being established, a lot of trading and culture building, and it was pre-European contact. The map that you can see right here is a map from 1605 by Alvaro Mexia. And what I just showed you, that basin with the rivers coming in, we call this the Tomoka now. Back then it was the Nokoroko. And then this is that peninsula, so that land peninsula, and then what's now the Halifax over here. So that morphology was, again, really remarkable back then, and it was noted as an important village, and in fact, one of the largest Native American settlements along the east coast of Florida at the time of Spanish contact. Over time, after European contact, there were 2 successive plantations on the property from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s. So there are literally layers of history at this site from 4,000 years of occupation and then all the way up to plantation era remains on top of that. And again, a lot of disturbance over the years, but many of those layers remain intact. Today, Tomoka is a state park, so it is in conservation. And the state park features a campground, hiking trails, a paddling trail. You can rent kayaks and canoes. There's a boat ramp. So really getting people out into nature, out on the water in this really special place. It's, like I said, jointly managed with Bulow Creek and Addison Blockhouse. So it's part of a larger contiguous conservation property in that area. But lots of neat features where people can get outside and explore. And they've done a nice job of honoring the history of the property and telling that story. And then what we want to do is contribute to the Tomoka of tomorrow, right? So part of this work is trying to maintain or restore resilient natural habitats that can last into the future. We want to limit any loss of artifacts or those natural resources. So we want to reduce erosion, try to keep that history intact, and try to keep the unique ecology of the area, that really neat estuarine basin with those riverine inputs. We want to protect that and keep the hydrology intact, and also promote sustainable access. We like that people can go and be part of this history now and moving forward. So now I'm going to get into the stabilization work a little bit more. And it started in 2016 when there was some significant erosion right along the point. And the park identified a need to just immediately stabilize that high energy area. And so DEP set up this rock revetment. This is looking up north. So this is sort of wrapping around the point. And there actually had some oyster bags in front of the rocks. And if you think back to that sage diagram, this is more on the gray side of living shorelines. So the park really wanted to explore some greener options for the medium and low energy areas of the park that were also eroding. Artifacts were becoming exposed and washing away, and they really wanted to maintain their property as well as maintain those cultural resources. So my colleague Melinda Donnelly had been doing a lot of living shoreline work in Canaveral National Seashore, which also has significant Native American middens and burial sites. And the living shoreline stabilization down there had been really successful in protecting those areas, slowing erosion, and stabilizing the shoreline. So the park reached out and said, help, come, what can we do? What are some options for us? And we went and developed a plan. The map on the bottom right, before I move on, this is, we're going to walk through, these are some of the different phases. So you'll see this map over and over, but right now we're talking about this yellow section right here. So the revetment is right here on this point, and then we're picking up just south of that. So again, you'll see this map a couple times, but this is just to kind of keep you oriented throughout the presentation. So here is our plan, and I'll walk you through it. This is an aerial view of the shoreline, believe it or not. So the top of the slide is the land, and the bottom of the slide is down into the water. So we're looking down on the shoreline. And at the top here, this is where we have our oak hammock, we have our shell midden. So there's some upland species here, some trees. And then where the mean high water line is, there's a pretty steep drop. So anywhere from 1/4 meter to 1 meter of an escarpment, where you have that active erosion and some patchy vegetation in there trying to hang on. The green through the blue is where we come in. So this is the plan that we had developed and what we had been using at Canaveral National Seashore. So you have your mangrove planting zone in green, 1 mangrove for every 2 feet. Below that, you have smooth cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora, similar densities, 1 plug every 2 feet. And then we had units of oyster shell bags laid perpendicular to the shore, and we were using 20-foot sections with 5-foot gaps in between for wildlife access. And this spacing is going to be important later, so keep that in the back of your minds. So what does that actually look like? Here's some photos. That's our mangroves. Again, we're using 2 to 3-year-old mangroves at that sort of upper level, and then down into the Spartina. And I want you to look at this sediment. This is a picture from Tomoka. I mean, these are almost entirely clam shells and oyster shells. You know, this is straight midden that we're digging into here. So we want to be really thoughtful about, any ground disturbance and that sort of thing. But this is the kind of sediment we're working with at this section. And then those oyster bags at the base. So this was in 2018. And this was the design of these first phases. So with funding from FWC and the National Estuary Program and quite a bit of in-kind match from UCF in terms of volunteer time and faculty time, we were able to do over 3,000 linear feet of stabilization at the park. So we used that plan that you just saw. We had a lot of engagement from the community through students and volunteers. And then we implemented a before-after control impact paired series monitoring design to look at how well this was going. So overall, the cost of this phase of the initial work was about $38 for a linear foot. That's really cheap for a living shoreline. That's a very, very good price. And we're really proud of this community engagement factor, which keeps those costs down. It also builds stewardship, right? Everybody who came, and one of the implementation days, the installation days, we had over 90 participants come. And so all of those people walk away with a sense of ownership, right? Not only have they now visited Tomoka State Park, but they've had a hand in, learning that story and then building that Tomoka of tomorrow. So it's a win-win to be able to engage the community on these projects where we can. So through our monitoring, we found that the oyster shell bags were serving as an effective wave break. We saw significant increases in the percent cover vegetation. Before we did stabilization, which you can see in that sort of top left, that A picture, we had less than 10% cover. And then, after a year, we had over 50% vegetation cover. Our plant survival at the site was really high, over 90% for all the plants, and erosion began to slow pretty quickly. So these particular phases, we had one segment that went in March. We call that phase 1 here, and then another segment that went in July of the same year. And so these are just showing you erosion, so loss in meters. So we were still having some erosion, but it was slowing down. And that's what we want to see. I think this is an important part of the Living Shoreline story. When you install these plants 2 feet apart, that are young and small, and you put these wave breaks in place, it's not an immediate reversal all the time. But these are the kinds of trends that we're looking for, that we want to see. And these trends continued, and now we've got accretion at the site. This is just some of the early monitoring. But what we've seen in a lot of the Living Shoreline projects is it takes about 2 years for the Living Shorelines to really settle in and take hold and be resilient. So again, these are some of the initial monitoring results that I pulled, but that trend continued. And then similarly, we saw mean percent cover vegetation. The starting percent cover was less than 10%. The March phase took a little while to hit that growing season. Once we got into those summer months, it really took off. And then that July phase took off much sooner. And then we saw a little bit of senescence getting into the winter months, or into the fall, I'm sorry. But again, much a significant increase from that initial starting. And again, our plant survival at these sites and longevity has been really, really good. So by that fall monitoring, we couldn't really tell the Spartina clumps apart. They had started to coalesce, and we were seeing about 40 shoots per meter squared of Spartina. And this is what it looked like in November. So not too long after installation. Around the same time, we had been working with the bees company, so the biodegradable elements for starting ecosystems. You may be familiar with bees mats. They are from the Netherlands and have been developing a variety of non-plastic restoration alternatives. They have used a lot of materials successfully in the Netherlands, and we've been working with them to see what might work in Florida. I know there's some other folks in the state and in the region who've also been testing out some of the materials. But this was one of the early options that we had. They made a cellulose oyster bag for us out of biodegradable wood fiber. And we didn't know, is the mesh too small? How's it going to work? But we tried out a few. We incorporated them into this, one of these early stages at Tomoka. You can see them here, just laid next to the oyster bags to see how they perform. And we laid these out in August. When I went back in September, I stood there scratching my head thinking, I swear we put it right here. And I finally noticed a few shreds of tattered material and a bunch of loose oyster shell. So unfortunately, these early prototypes didn't even last a month, and we were back to the drawing board. So one of the lessons we've learned with our colleagues in the Netherlands is things last a lot longer in their cold climates than they do here in Florida. They get pretty beat up here. But we were back to the drawing board on that, and but still wanting to explore some more options. So moving forward to the next phase in 2019 and 2020, we did some additional work using oyster bags. So again, at this time, we really didn't have many other options, and the bags were doing a good job. They were providing a wave break. We were having very high plant survival. And so this was a need that the park requested over on the east side. And so there's higher salinity here, and we had higher oyster recruitment on the materials. This is a picture of installation in 2020 and that same area in 2025. There are some oysters growing on here, especially on the front side of this, but you can see that vegetation's been able to grow right up to the oyster bags. We've got some sediment accumulation behind, and just kind of holding strong there. So now we're getting into 2021 and 2022, and we received a grant from Florida Coastal Management Partnership to test saw-sided gabions. So these are oyster bags made of chicken wire, and oyster volcanoes, which you can see here on the bottom. They're jute fiber dipped in cement coating and formed into this volcano shape. So we wanted to test these non-plastic materials as oyster wave break, and the FCMP grant gave us funding to test these materials side by side in 3 parks near Tomoka: North Peninsula State Park, Gamble Rogers, and Washington Oaks Gardens. We did 500 feet in each park, 250 feet of each treatment. And with some funding from the National Estuary Program, we also were able to do 100 feet of shoreline in Tomoka. So we had some more areas on that east side that I just showed you where we were able to test these materials. And it was a really neat opportunity because we could monitor them. They were put out around a similar time. We could monitor them and kind of see how these materials behaved and if they could provide similar benefits that we were seeing from the oyster bags. You know, could we get the same stabilization that we were getting from the Naltex bags without introducing plastics? So again, we had really high plant survival at these sites. You can see the spartina and mangroves planted right behind the volcanoes here. We had pretty positive results in terms of plant protection initially, but we had much better longevity for the volcanoes. So within 2 years, actually, there was nothing left of these gabions. They ghosted on us, and we went back out, and it was just kind of, you know, some falling apart metal and oyster shell. Whereas these volcanoes, you can see there's quite a bit of oyster recruitment on them. We're starting to get quite a bit of settlement and growth there. And again, that vegetation is filling in right behind. We saw similar outcomes with the gabions at other sites. Some places they worked just fine and lasted a while, but most places they fell apart within 2 years. So given that really important lesson, we move forward to the next phase, which was just recently in 2025, in April, and the park brought to our attention this area in blue. So this is right along the Tomoka River, and it's called Sunset Picnic Area. And so there's fishing dock and picnic area and restrooms and parking for park visitors. But this was a little bit different from these other areas. This had a lower salinity. You had this more riverine input here, and you would get some freshwater pulses after large rain events. But there was certainly a need for stabilization, and I'll show you the pictures on the next slide. So in April, we did, with some FWC funding, we did 640 feet along the Tomoka River. And this time we incorporated the volcanoes along with our mangroves and spartina in that same kind of design. But no more plastic. We're moving forward with those volcanoes. Now we're moving up in cost too, right? Remember I said the plastic bags we were doing for about $38 a linear foot. This particular one cost us about $141 per linear foot. Again, lots of community engagement, but currently these non-plastics are a bit more expensive. So just a trade-off to consider when moving forward with those materials. So this is a picture on the top left of what it looked like before, and you can see there's really not much shoreline habitat there. It just kind of goes from one habitat right to another. And so when we install these volcanoes, we build a staggered line, and then behind them we put that Spartina and those mangroves. So we want to rebuild that shoreline slope. We want to soften things up. We don't put any fill to regrade it. That is an option on living shoreline projects, but it's not how we've approached anything at Tomoka. We've just been using what's there and putting the plants in the grade that exists. And then a month post, you can see those volcanoes are starting to get a little bit of a fouling community on them, and the plants are settling in. What I want you to notice about these pictures is that this is a really, really different sediment than we saw in that other Spartina picture with the shell. So this is kind of outside of that midden footprint. This is much sandier. There's more tannins in the water. It's lower salinity. And, we've also been exploring the use of the POSH modules. These are the pervious oyster shell habitats that were developed by University of North Florida. They've been really, really promising in Northeast Florida and other areas. We've been using them a bit in Canaveral, and it's been going quite well. And we went back and forth on what to use at this sunset picnic area. If we use POSH or volcanoes. We decided to go with volcanoes because there's really not a shell signature here. There's not a lot of oysters, and what we primarily need in this area is protection for those plants. These volcanoes will give us a couple of years of protection on those plants, let them really settle in, and then let that root structure take over as the volcanoes eventually degrade. They're just made of coconut fiber and cement, so we're not introducing anything other than plant fiber and calcium carbonate into this system. We're not going to leave behind a shell signature. The POSH modules are made of oyster shell held together with cement. And so they introduce, it's a look of an oyster and also oyster material. So when we're thinking about some of these non-plastic materials, it's really important to consider what's already at your site. How will this blend in? Will this, be the appropriate material for this location? And even within one park, we've seen that the POSH modules might be appropriate for some sections where we have live oysters and oyster recruitment and that shell signature and that midden, but they may not be appropriate for other sections that are, again, a little bit lower salinity. They're not part of that midden. They don't have as much oyster survival. So we might think about, those kinds of considerations when we're choosing our materials. At this site, we've seen, again, really high survival of our planted mangroves and cordgrass, upwards of 95%, and we've already seen increases of vegetation cover in those areas. Again, that was just 8 months ago. And don't worry, if this is really exciting to you, you can come out on March 10th and 11th because we're doing more. There's a section just north of the bridge shown here in white, where that's been on the park's priority list as well. And we have some funding again through FWC to tackle that. So it's about 700 feet there. It looks like this in the picture bordered in white. So again, you just kind of have that upland and then a scarp and then down to the shoreline. So we'd like to soften this a little bit with some mangroves and Spartina and reduce the erosion that's happening here. In addition to the 700 feet there, we're going to come back to this yellow area and fill in some sections. So remember I mentioned that we did 28-foot sections before. Our permit allows for 75-foot sections. If you've done a living shoreline project, that's the standard size allowable in the permits. And so the park has asked, actually, can we go in and connect some of those smaller segments to create larger contiguous footprints of living shoreline. We've seen some scalloping, which is pretty typical for these kinds of designs. And then there were areas that they asked to leave open for visitor access that the park is now saying, oh, we're really losing a lot more there than we thought we were. And so we'd like to extend the living shoreline in some of those areas that were previously left open. We'll also go through and replace any, plastic bags that may be deteriorating or not meeting the needs. That's something that we're committed to on all of our projects. So once all of the materials have a lifespan, and as these plastic materials reach the end of their lifespan, we are happy to replace them with non-plastics moving forward. So, and likewise, if the non-plastics meet the end of their lifespan, we want something in place that's going to work. So I just wanted to show you this aerial imagery, which is from late in 2025, I think November, December, but you can see right around the point that rock revetment right there. And then you start to see our living shoreline modules pick up just south of there. And so those are those 20-foot modules, those sort of little pockets. This is a section that the park asked us to leave open for access. And then you see our modules pick up again. So these are the areas that will join some of these together to create longer stretches and just have a little bit better connectivity and fill in some of these areas at the request of the park. This was a really large beach area that the park asked to leave open, but they want to shrink this because you can see we're still having quite a bit of loss there. So the plan is to extend the living shoreline and kind of shrink this open area. We'll still leave some fishing and beach access there, but they just want to be thoughtful about the cultural resources that are all washing away. And then our living shorelines pick up again here and extend quite a ways south. But I thought that was kind of cool that you could see on Google Earth our modules, and that they're really holding that vegetation out along the edge here. So with that, again, huge thanks to all of the partners that have contributed, to my collaborators here from UCF. Oops. As I was going through these pictures, I realized we all apparently like to take photos of us standing next to mangroves for height comparison. So we have Dr. Melinda Donnelly here with a mangrove that we planted in 2019 at Tomoka. And this was just 3 years later. Dr. Paul Sachs, similarly, this is about a 2-year-old white mangrove that we planted. I didn't have any pictures of Linda next to a mangrove. She's often found on oyster reefs, though, so I thought this was a great one. And then I had to include this photo on the bottom left. This is my son, Simon, who was born 1 month before these mangroves were planted at Tomoka. So Simon and these mangroves were born about the same time here. And I thought this was a cool picture side by side to see how they've grown. So I'm happy to answer any questions and chat more. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions coming in. First one is, I'm interested in knowing more about the labor and cost differences between the POSH modules and the volcanoes. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure. So we've been leaning pretty heavily on Marine Discovery Center to create these materials. I know UCF also makes some of them in-house, but the volcanoes and POSH, they both involve cement, so they're a bit messy, and they essentially hold these 2 to 3 hour workshops with volunteers. And volcanoes, you're kind of dipping the jute fiber into cement and you're molding them into these units and then wrapping them to dry and cure. The POSH modules, you have a cement mixer, you're loading in a bucket of shell, water, and cement, turning it in the cement mixer and then pouring it into a mold. And I actually have a picture of that mold. Let's see. Oh, too far. So they're essentially these upside down planters. And so they sit in these molds. And both materials are really nice because they're very adaptable. So you could make these taller, you can make these wider, depending on your site needs. You could make them, flatter. But this is kind of what they look like when they come out. And then this is a picture of one on the right here. This is one that we put out in Mosquito Lagoon in March, I believe. And I just took this picture last month. So tremendous amount of oyster growth. They look like really natural oyster clusters pretty quickly, and they incorporate that recycled shell. So I know a lot of our partners in the area have invested significant time and energy getting these shell recycling programs up and running. And so if you want that, that shell as part of your project design and part of your materials, it's a relatively low cost material, and again, looks pretty natural straight away. Price-wise, they're pretty similar. I don't know if Tess is on from MDC to talk about that, but they're pretty similar because they require similar amounts of labor, and they're about the same size.
Mhm. Okay, perfect. Just a reminder, if you guys have a question, please feel free to put it into the Q&A section, as opposed to raising your hand or putting it in the chat. That's the only way that we're able to answer questions during this webinar. Gonna stay on the same train of thought of the volcanoes. How long does it take for the volcanoes to deteriorate?
That largely depends on the recruitment, the oyster recruitment in the area. So I'll use the Posh as an example just because we have this up on the screen. But if you don't have a lot of oyster recruitment onto a volcano, we see them start to break down at about 3 years, but it probably takes 3 to 5 years to fully degrade. It's still pretty new, so we haven't really seen we don't have any projects where the volcanoes have completely broken down yet. And I think our oldest volcanoes are maybe 4 or 5 years old. So if that gives you an idea. If you get a lot of oyster recruitment on them, like you see on this Posh module, they will last a very, very, very long time, indefinitely until these oysters suffer some, calamity. But if you don't have a lot of recruitment, then I would guess 5 to 10 years. If you do have recruitment, significantly longer.
Yeah, because I know that we've also seen like crabs kind of picking at the jutes, and it just depends on how well I think the cement covers the jute. Because if there's holes and seawater starts to get in there, the jute starts to erode quicker than the cement does. So I haven't seen one fully disappear yet, but I have definitely seen
Right.
look like they're melting into the ground a little bit, but
Yeah.
still providing stabilization. So
Right,
they still
right.
work.
And again, I think that's a important part of this conversation that all these materials have a lifespan.
Mhm.
And so part of it is weighing the trade-offs of, how often we need to be adjusting our projects, replacing materials. With sea level rise, we may need to be shifting things. But there's nothing that we can put out there and like set it and forget it forever.
Yes, yeah, that's a great
And
point.
so it's just a matter of understanding the longevity of your materials given the other conditions at your site. And we're pretty focused on oysters here, but there's lots of other fouling organisms that like these. You'll get barnacles and sponges and all kinds of things growing on these. We see a lot of stone crabs that find their way into the middle of a volcano and just kind of camp out, which is kind of cool. But they're little ecosystems and on their own.
Excellent. So you did mention the biodegradable oyster bags, either the chicken wire jute ones. You also mentioned the cellulose ones that only lasted a month. How long would a biodegradable bag need to last in order to stabilize a shoreline long term?
Yeah, again, I think that depends on kind of what's going on at your site. We see big differences in areas with high salinity versus low salinity, and we see differences in areas where there's a lot of heavy oyster recruitment versus not. And if you've hit your target elevations, you'll get a lot more oyster recruitment. So um, we're we're currently exploring some other biodegradable bag options, again, with the bees folks, and there's a larger project through the Hart Institute with Texas A&M, where we're testing out basalt bags and then some other non-plastic. It's like it's sort of like a bioplastic, but it's biodegradable. And just seeing how those do in Texas and in Florida. So that's ongoing currently. So there's still options out there. I'm excited to see where technology takes us. I think there's
Yes, me too.
a lot of opportunity there, and that's sort of beyond my realm of expertise. I'm so glad we have partners that understand all the different nuances of the various types of plastic and what lasts longer wear. And again, what we found from our colleagues in the Netherlands is it depends. You've got cold water, warm water, sunshine. Is it wet and dry or is it wet all the time? That's all going to play into how long your materials last.
Yes. And yeah, you guys have been working with the Bees Company out of the Netherlands for a long time now, right? Like almost 5+ years since they came out
Yeah.
with their original um, bee honeycomb squares, right? Have you
Mm-hmm.
noticed any improvements with the bees products since you've started working with them?
Yeah, I mean, and again, there's other folks in Florida who have collaborated with them. I know Christine Angelini and Patrick Norby with University of Florida, have done some testing, applying their materials to salt marshes. There's been some work in the Caribbean using materials for seagrass restoration. So there's lots of different applications, and there there's certainly some improvements with their products because they're very open and curious about, all right, well, if it doesn't work, what are the needs? Do you need it to last longer? Do you need it to be thicker? Do you need the mesh to be larger? How does it hold up in storage? They're interested in all of these things. And so it's been fun to kind of explore different options with them, and for them to see how they perform here and kind of what our needs are. They're always willing to go back and make tweaks and try new things. And I think that's been part of the fun journey, and why we're still working with them, because they're coming up with new ideas that meet the needs of our systems.
Absolutely. How do you factor in sea level rise into your shoreline restoration planning?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a huge factor in these projects because the slope is not what would be ideal for upslope migration of these habitats, but that's what we're trying to achieve with some of these living shoreline projects. We want to accrete sediment along that slope, so that those plants have room to move up the slope. If there's a scarp, that's a quarter meter, a half meter of a cliff, those plants can't go anywhere.
Right.
And so we know that they're not going to be resilient to sea level rise. If we can install a living shoreline and rebuild that slope and soften it up a little bit, those plants have a fighting chance of, being able to migrate upslope. Typically, what we're doing is, in terms of target elevations, we're looking at, what's the range for oyster elevation in an area, and we're targeting the top of that range with our oyster materials because we're assuming that range is going to move up slope over time. And so if we put our oyster materials at the top of that range, as the range itself moves, the oysters will remain in that range for as long as possible.
That's a great point.
And so we really want to target, the top range of marsh, the top range of mangroves, the top range of oysters, so that as everything shifts upslope, that habitat can remain.
That's a really great point. Thank you. Okay, we don't have any questions left, so I'm going to ask our last question of the day. What excites you the most about the future of living shorelines in your region specifically?
My region specifically, there are two components that excite me the most. One is the fact that we have a lot of conservation land. Northeast Florida, there are a lot of amazing, state parks and federal lands and the GTM Research Reserve and DoD properties. So there's a lot of land already in conservation to work with, and a lot of focus on, building these corridors and connecting these habitats and making sure that there's room for marsh migration and that sort of thing. So we can always do better, but we're not starting from nothing, which is good.
Right.
The other thing that excites me most is just the people that are working on this. I mean, just the enthusiasm, the curiosity, the ideas, the dedication. And I mean, from the research side to the application side, the students that are coming through these programs and helping on these projects, it's just really, really encouraging every day out there. So that's another reason I like the community engagement project so much. And I think there's power in it for our conservation lands, but there's also power in it for our conservation community to know that we are a community and we're all trying to move this science forward. We're all, pitching in what we can to make this work and to continue doing better all the time.
I love that. My favorite thing about these webinars is as soon as I say that there are no more questions, we get a flood of them in, which is awesome because it's just jogging people's thoughts. Next question. Are there private properties are private properties able to do these projects either on their own or through consulting experts and on their own specific property? Not asking about neighbors' property or HOA property. Can homeowners do this on their own lands?
Yes, absolutely. You can do this on your own land. If you do anything below mean high water, you do need a permit. But our permitting agencies have implemented some nationwide permits, exemptions, different things to help streamline that process where possible for living shorelines. There are a lot of great resources. FloridaLivingShorelines.com, which I mentioned before, has a ton of resources for homeowners. And then I just sent out through the ERTs a brand new EDIS document through IFAS that's steps to connecting Floridians to living shorelines. And it's a how-to document on if you want to do a living shoreline on your private property, what does that process look like? How do you find a contractor? How do you come up with a site design? What are the resources available? So there are a lot of great resources out there.
Excellent. Yeah, the Florida Living Shorelines website is definitely, I think, one of our top resources in Florida. You can learn all about how homeowners can get involved, how to find marine contractors to do the work for you. It's a great asset that I think most of us on this call have been involved in creating. Annie, you created it, so
I helped. I didn't create it. I was
yeah,
on the
well,
team for
yeah.
a long time. But
Um,
yeah, it's continuing on, and yeah, hopefully is a good resource for people.
Yeah, we have our update meeting tomorrow, actually. So, have you or do you know of anyone who has looked at historical land use and changes and erosional changes of sediment when selecting your sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of, when you apply for a permit for these kinds of things, part of what you're looking at is the, soil maps, what's there. And one of the first things that we probably all do is look at all the historical aerial imagery of a site, and then any other historical resources just to see how quickly are things eroding, what are sort of the factors at play, and are we seeing, how does the sediment play into that? So yes, that's certainly something we look at when we're doing site selection, but also project design, because depending on whether the erosion is coming from the top side,
Mhm.
where it's, rainfall, precipitation coming down the slope and sloughing things down, or whether it's coming from the water side from wind and wave action, that's going to, again, play into your site design and the materials that you might use. So definitely part of the process.
Excellent. And I think a good question that kind of plugs into that is you mentioned that the Park Service is the one that has been picking the sites for you guys in Tomoka State Park. Do you guys have any inputs in the sites that you're picking, or does the park come to you and say, hey, this is a really popular fishing spot where we're noticing it eroding over time?
It
Or
happens
how do you
both
guys pick the
ways.
sites in Tomoka?
Yeah, it happens both ways. In this situation, the park came to Dr. Donnelly again because she'd been doing a lot of the midden work down in Canaveral, and it was a similar issue to what they'd been facing. Once we kind of go on site with the landowner, they kind of show us what they've been noticing, and obviously the park managers know their properties so well. And we had the advantage of that time. The park manager and the assistant park manager had both been there for like 3 decades. So they had really witnessed a lot of this happening. We do have some input though for Tomoka in particular, there's a section that is experiencing some erosion, but it's very, very steep, like 15 feet tall, and a much higher energy situation, and has some existing riprap and some things that are a little bit outside of sort of what our normal project design does. So, our input on that is this isn't going to work in that area. We need a little bit more time to develop a plan there. So the park kind of brings us like, hey, this is what we've noticed. We'd like to stop the erosion, and we can say, hey, we think this would work, or we think we need another design, and that kind of thing. It can also happen that, we identify projects and then we're coming to landowners saying, hey, have you guys noticed anything going on over here? We think we can help with that.
Great. Awesome. Well, Annie, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. For those of you still on the call, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel by the end of the afternoon, and we will go ahead and plug it on our Facebook as well. And since you signed up for this webinar, you signed up for our entire series this year. That's how we're doing it. So our next webinar is going to be on February 18th. We are going to hear from Ness Michaels with In-Water Research about Lake Worth Lagoon sea turtle research. So we will see you guys next month at 2 p.m. and thank you so much for joining us.